Princess Diana didn't just wear dresses. She turned fabric into million-dollar legends. Let's start with something simple. A dress. Just fabric, stitching, maybe a zipper that occasionally betrays you at the worst possible moment. In normal life, a dress is something you spill coffee on, regret buying, and eventually donate with the quiet hope that someone else understands your poor decisions. But then there was Princess Diana, and suddenly, a dress wasn't a dress anymore. It was history. It was emotion. It was apparently worth more than a house in Ohio. Now here's where things get weird. People didn't just admire Diana's dresses, they collected them, like baseball cards, except instead of chewing gum stains, you had silk gowns worn at royal galas, and instead of trading with your neighbor's kid, you needed a bank loan and possibly a mild identity crisis. One of her dresses sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars, not because it had diamonds sewn into it, not because it granted magical powers, but because Diana once stood in it, smiled in it, and probably made the entire room feel underdressed just by existing. That's it. That's the business model. And the buyers? These weren't confused tourists. These were serious collectors. People who looked at a piece of clothing and thought, yes, I would like to spend the equivalent of a luxury car on something I cannot wear without security escort and emotional preparation. Because let's be honest, you don't casually wear a Princess Diana dress. You don't throw it on for brunch. You don't wear it to a wedding unless you're trying to start a small war. You definitely don't wear it to a family gathering unless your goal is to silently dominate every conversation without speaking. No, owning one of these dresses is less about fashion and more about possession. It's like owning a piece of a moment. A snapshot of history where everything aligned: cameras, attention, and Diana's almost supernatural ability to look effortlessly iconic while the rest of humanity struggles with wrinkles and static electricity. And here's the part that really breaks your brain. The value of these dresses didn't come from rarity alone. Designers make rare clothes all the time. You can find limited editions, custom pieces, one-of-a-kind outfits, but those don't explode in value like Diana's wardrobe did. Because the real ingredient wasn't silk, it was story. Every dress Diana wore came with a narrative. This wasn't just a black dress. This was the black dress, the one worn after a very public royal scandal, the one that said without saying a word, "I'm still here, and I look incredible." That dress didn't just sell, it spoke. And buyers weren't purchasing fabric. They were buying a moment of quiet revenge wrapped in elegance. Think about that. Most people process emotional trauma by eating ice cream or posting vague quotes online. Diana processed it by stepping out in a dress so powerful it became a cultural reset. And decades later, someone pays a fortune to own that energy. That's not fashion. That's mythology. Now, imagine explaining this to someone completely out of context. Yes, I paid $500,000 for this dress. Oh wow, what does it do? It reminds me of a time in 1994 when a princess walked out of a car and emotionally destroyed the concept of bad timing. That's the pitch, and somehow it works. But the madness doesn't stop there, because once one dress sells for a fortune, suddenly everything Diana ever wore becomes a potential goldmine. Evening gowns, cocktail dresses, even outfits that were probably chosen on a busy morning with the royal equivalent of, "This looks fine." And collectors? They start circling. Because in this world, proximity to Diana equals value. If she wore it, it matters. If she was photographed in it, it matters more. If the moment attached to it had even a hint of drama, scandal, or triumph, congratulations, you're now bidding against people who treat auctions like Olympic sports. And auctions, by the way, are where things get beautifully ridiculous. Picture a room full of very serious people, quiet, focused, holding little paddles like they're about to politely fight each other. And the item up for grabs? A dress. Not a rare artifact from ancient history, not a lost masterpiece. A dress. And yet, the tension in the room feels like someone's about to buy the moon. Bids climb, numbers escalate. Someone in the back casually raises their paddle like they're ordering coffee. And just like that, the price jumps by tens of thousands. All for something that, in another universe, might have been hanging in a closet next to a slightly wrinkled blazer. And the winner? They don't just walk away with fabric. They walk away with a story, a symbol, and the quiet understanding that they've just spent more on a dress than most people spend on a lifetime of clothing. But here's the twist. it still somehow feels worth it. Because Diana wasn't just wearing these dresses, she was transforming them, giving them meaning, turning ordinary design into unforgettable moments. And in a world where most clothes are forgotten the second they're worn, that kind of impact? That's priceless. Or apparently very precisely priced at auction. And the more you look at these auctions, the more you start to realize something slightly unsettling. This was never really about clothing in the first place, because if it were, fashion historians would be the only ones fighting over these pieces, quietly debating stitching techniques and fabric quality like professors arguing over ancient manuscripts. But that's not what happened, not even close. Instead, you had investors, celebrities, museums, and extremely determined collectors all converging on the same racks of fabric like it was the last lifeboat off a sinking ship. And that's because Diana's dresses had quietly crossed a line that very few objects ever do. They stopped being objects and became symbols. And once something becomes a symbol, logic politely exits the room and takes a long vacation. Because now, you're not buying a dress, you're buying proximity to a feeling, a moment, a person who somehow managed to be both the most photographed woman on earth and still feel like the only real one in the room. And that contradiction is where the value lives, because Diana had this rare, almost uncomfortable ability to make royalty feel human and humanity feel important at the same time. And her dresses became the visual proof of that, every appearance carefully balanced between tradition and rebellion, elegance and quiet defiance, like she was constantly playing chess with an entire institution while the rest of the world thought it was just a fashion show. And nowhere was that more obvious than in the way her style evolved over time, because early Diana dressed like the system wanted her to. Soft colors, polite silhouettes, the kind of outfits that whispered instead of spoke. But as the years went on, something shifted, and suddenly the dresses weren't just participating in the moment, they were controlling it. They were sharper, bolder, more deliberate, like she had realized that if the world was going to watch her anyway, she might as well give them something worth remembering. And that's when the transformation really began, because now every dress carried intention, every appearance felt like a message, and the public picked up on it instantly. Even if they couldn't explain it, they felt it. That subtle shift from princess-wearing clothes to woman-using clothes, and that distinction is everything, because one is passive and the other is powerful. And power, as it turns out, is extremely collectible, especially when it's wrapped in silk and photographed from every possible angle. And the media, of course, played its part in turning these moments into permanent cultural landmarks, because every time Diana stepped out, it wasn't just an appearance, it was an event. Cameras flashing like a small-scale lightning storm, headlines ready before she even left the car. And those images didn't just document the dresses, they amplified them, turning a single outfit into a global memory within hours, which meant that by the time those dresses eventually reached auction houses, they weren't just garments. They were already famous, already recognized, already loaded with emotional context. And that's a very dangerous combination when money enters the room, because now you have people bidding not just on what something is, but on what it represents. And representation, unlike fabric, doesn't have a clear price ceiling, which is how you end up in a situation where a dress that once hung quietly in a royal wardrobe suddenly commands the kind of attention usually reserved for priceless art. And in many ways, that's exactly what it became. Wearable history. Except instead of being locked behind glass in a museum from the beginning, it lived a life first. It moved through real moments, real emotions, real headlines, and only later became an artifact, which makes it infinitely more compelling than something that was created to be preserved from day one. Because these dresses weren't designed to sit still, they were designed to be seen, to be worn, to exist in motion, and that sense of life never really leaves them, even when they're displayed under perfect lighting with security guards nearby, because everyone looking at them knows they've already done something, they've already been somewhere, they've already meant something to millions of people who will never touch them. And that's the strange paradox at the center of all this. The idea that something so personal, a dress worn by one woman in one moment, can become so universal that complete strangers are willing to compete for ownership of it decades later. And the buyers themselves often understand this better than anyone, which is why so many of these dresses don't disappear into private closets. They end up in exhibitions, traveling collections, carefully curated displays where the public can come and stand a few feet away from something they've already seen 1,000 times in photographs, but now it's real. Now it has weight, texture, presence, and suddenly the idea of paying a fortune for it doesn't seem quite as absurd, because you're not just looking at a dress anymore, you're looking at a moment that somehow survived time. And that's the real secret behind all of this. The reason people kept paying more, bidding higher, caring deeper. Because in a world where almost everything is temporary, Diana's dresses became one of the few things that felt permanent. Not because they couldn't fade or age, but because the meaning attached to them refused to disappear. And once something reaches that level, where its value is tied not to what it is but to what it represents, you're no longer dealing with fashion, you're dealing with legacy. And legacy, unlike fabric, doesn't wrinkle, doesn't go out of style, and most importantly, doesn't come cheap. And just when you think the story settles into something almost understandable, collectors, auctions, legacy, all neatly packaged into the idea of historical value, something even stranger starts to happen. Because the dresses don't just sit there quietly accumulating price tags, they begin to influence the present, shaping how people see fashion, power, and even identity itself. As if Diana's wardrobe didn't end with her, but instead continued evolving through everyone who studies it, imitates it, or tries to decode it like some kind of beautifully tailored puzzle. And designers in particular became almost obsessed with this, not in the way artists admire a masterpiece from afar, but in the way engineers study a machine they can't quite reverse engineer. Because Diana's style wasn't just about what she wore, it was about when she wore it, how she wore it, and more importantly, why it worked in a way that felt completely effortless, and yet was anything but accidental. And this is where things get fascinating, because if you look closely, you start to see that her dresses weren't just reactions to events. They were anticipations of them, carefully chosen signals sent ahead of time, like she understood the emotional temperature of the world before the rest of us even realized there was a forecast. And that kind of instinct is nearly impossible to replicate, which is why so many attempts to capture the Diana effect end up feeling like expensive imitations rather than genuine moments. Because you can copy a silhouette, you can recreate a color palette, but you can't mass-produce authenticity. And authenticity, as it turns out, is the most valuable fabric of all, even though it doesn't exist on any designer's supply list. And this realization started to ripple outward, affecting not just high fashion but the entire idea of celebrity image making. Because Diana quietly rewrote the rules without ever announcing that she was doing it. She demonstrated that clothing could be both armor and language at the same time, that a single outfit could soften public perception, redirect media narratives, or completely redefine how a person is seen. And once that door was opened, it never really closed again. Suddenly, every public figure was expected to communicate through what they wore, whether they realized it or not. And that expectation traces back, in no small part, to the way Diana turned her wardrobe into a kind of visual conversation with the world, one that people are still trying to interpret decades later. And here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Because while collectors were busy turning her dresses into high-value artifacts, museums and institutions began to treat them as cultural documents, pieces of evidence from a very specific moment in time when public life, media, and personal identity collided in a way that felt entirely new. And these exhibitions didn't just display the dresses, they contextualized them, placing them alongside photographs, headlines, and footage that reminded viewers that these weren't isolated objects. They were part of a much larger narrative, one that involved not just a princess, but an entire world watching, reacting, projecting, and sometimes even projecting too much, because Diana became, in many ways, a mirror, reflecting whatever people needed to see at the time: grace, rebellion, vulnerability, strength. And her dresses became the frames that held those reflections in place, which explains why standing in front of one of them in a museum feels different than looking at any other historical garment. There's a strange sense of familiarity mixed with distance, like you've seen it before, but never quite like this. And that emotional response is exactly what keeps the value alive. Because as long as people feel something when they look at these dresses, they will continue to matter. And as long as they matter, they will continue to be sought after. Studied, and yes, occasionally fought over in auction rooms where logic takes a backseat to sentiment. But perhaps the most interesting part of all this is how the meaning of these dresses continues to evolve over time. Because what they represented in the 1980s and 1990s isn't exactly what they represent now. Back then, they were part of a living, unfolding story, moments captured in real time. But today, they've become something else entirely, symbols of a kind of cultural shift, a reminder of a period when the relationship between public figures and the public itself was changing rapidly, becoming more personal, more immediate, more emotionally charged, and Diana was right at the center of that shift, whether she intended to be or not. And her wardrobe became one of the clearest visual records of that transformation, which is why it continues to resonate even with people who weren't alive during her lifetime, because the themes embedded in those dresses, visibility, vulnerability, reinvention, are still very much relevant, perhaps even more so now, in a world where image is currency and perception can change overnight. And this ongoing relevance adds yet another layer to their value, because now you're not just looking at history, you're looking at something that still feels current, still feels connected to the way we live and communicate today. And that connection is what keeps the story moving forward, because as long as people continue to find meaning in these dresses, they will never truly become relics of the past. They will remain active participants in an ongoing conversation about identity, influence, and the strange, powerful relationship between what we wear and what the world sees. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing of all, that something as simple as a dress, fabric, thread, design, can carry so much weight, so much story, so much lasting impact that decades later, we're still trying to fully understand it. Still trying to explain why people paid fortunes for them, and still, in many ways, coming up just short of a complete answer, because some things aren't meant to be fully explained, only observed, felt, and occasionally, if you have enough money and a very convincing reason, purchased. And yet, just when it feels like we've mapped out the entire phenomenon, legacy, symbolism, cultural impact, there's another layer that quietly changes everything. Because at some point the question shifts from why are these dresses valuable to something far more uncomfortable, why do people need them to be valuable? And that's where the story stops being about Diana alone and starts revealing something about us, about the way humans assign meaning to objects as if we're afraid that memories might disappear unless we physically anchor them to something we can point at, protect, ensure, and, if necessary, outbid someone else for. Because the truth is, Diana didn't just leave behind a legacy, she left behind a gap, a kind of cultural silence that people have been trying to fill ever since. And her dresses became one of the most tangible ways to do that, almost like emotional placeholders, objects that allow people to feel closer to a moment that is otherwise unreachable. And that explains why the demand never really faded, even as trends changed, even as generations shifted. Because this wasn't tied to fashion cycles, it was tied to something much deeper, something closer to collective memory. And memory, unlike fashion, doesn't follow seasons. It lingers, it evolves. It sometimes even grows stronger with time, especially when it's connected to a figure as globally recognized and emotionally resonant as Diana. And this is where the auction houses began to understand that they weren't just selling items. They were curating experiences, crafting narratives around each piece that made the act of buying feel less like a transaction and more like participation in history. Because every dress came with a story, and every story came with a moment that people either remembered firsthand or felt like they should have remembered. And that sense of shared experience is incredibly powerful. It creates a kind of invisible bond between strangers who all recognize the same image, the same moment, the same feeling, even if they've never met. And owning a dress from that moment becomes, in a way, owning a piece of that shared understanding, which sounds abstract until you see how people behave in those auction rooms. Because what looks like quiet bidding is actually something much more intense, a subtle competition not just for possession, but for connection, for the right to say, "This matters to me more." And that's where the numbers start to climb into territory that no longer makes practical sense, because practicality was never invited to this conversation in the first place. This is about emotion, identity, nostalgia, and the human tendency to assign almost sacred value to things that remind us of something, or someone, we don't want to lose. And Diana, perhaps more than any public figure of her time, became exactly that kind of presence. someone people felt connected to even without ever meeting her, which is a rare and powerful phenomenon because it blurs the line between public and personal in a way that makes every object associated with her feel strangely intimate, even when it's displayed behind glass or cataloged in an auction booklet. And that intimacy is what transforms these dresses from historical artifacts into emotional artifacts, objects that don't just represent events but evoke feelings. And feelings, as we all know, are notoriously difficult to measure, which is why their value can seem so unpredictable, so disproportionate, so completely detached from the material reality of the object itself, because you're not paying for fabric. You're paying for what that fabric makes you feel, and that's a currency that doesn't follow normal rules. It expands and contracts based on perception, context, and sometimes even timing, because certain moments in history have a way of reigniting interest, reminding people why something mattered in the first place. And when that happens, the value doesn't just return, it often increases, as if time itself is adding layers to the story, making it richer, more complex, more desirable. And this is exactly what we've seen with Diana's dresses over the years, a steady transformation from contemporary fashion into timeless symbols. And that transformation isn't accidental. It's the result of continuous attention, continuous storytelling, continuous reinterpretation by each new generation that encounters her image, her story, and her style for the first time. Because every generation sees something slightly different in Diana. Some focus on her elegance, others on her independence, others still on her vulnerability. And each of those perspectives adds another dimension to the meaning of the dresses, making them not just static objects but evolving ones, capable of carrying new interpretations without losing their original significance. And that kind of adaptability is incredibly rare, especially in the world of fashion, where most items are designed to be replaced, forgotten, moved on from. But Diana's dresses refused to follow that path. They resisted obsolescence. They remained relevant in a way that feels almost intentional, even though it wasn't. Because relevance, in this case, isn't about staying trendy. It's about staying meaningful. And meaning, once established at this level, doesn't fade easily. It embeds itself into culture, into memory, into the way people talk about the past and imagine the future. And that's why these dresses continue to command attention, continue to attract buyers, continue to be discussed, analyzed, displayed, and yes, occasionally mythologized to a degree that borders on legend. Because at some point, the line between history and myth becomes difficult to distinguish, especially when the subject at the center of it all was already larger than life in so many ways. And Diana, with her unique combination of visibility, relatability, and quiet defiance, became exactly that kind of figure. Someone whose presence could elevate even the simplest object into something extraordinary. And once that transformation happens, it can't be undone because the object is no longer just what it was. It's what it became. And what it became, in this case, is something people are still trying to understand, still trying to quantify, still trying to connect with, even decades later. Which brings us back to the dresses themselves, hanging in controlled environments, preserved with meticulous care, treated with the kind of respect usually reserved for priceless works of art. And in many ways, that's exactly what they are, not because of their design alone, but because of the story they carry, the emotions they evoke, and the enduring question they leave behind. What is the true value of something that means this much to so many people, and can that value ever really be measured? Or is it something that exists just beyond the reach of numbers, quietly shaping the way we remember, the way we feel, and the way we choose to hold on to the past? And by this point, something even more unusual begins to emerge, because the dresses are no longer just being preserved, admired, or sold. They're being interpreted, almost like ancient artifacts from a civilization we thought we understood, but clearly didn't fully appreciate at the time. And that shift from ownership to interpretation changes everything, because now the question isn't just what did Diana wear, but what was she saying when she wore it? And suddenly every stitch, every color, every silhouette becomes part of a larger conversation that people are still trying to decode, like a visual language that never came with a dictionary. And the more experts, historians, and even casual observers look at these dresses, the more they start to realize that Diana wasn't just participating in fashion. She was using it strategically, sometimes subtly, sometimes boldly, but almost always deliberately. And that realization has led to a kind of retrospective analysis that feels closer to studying political speeches than wardrobe choices. Because in many ways, that's exactly what these outfits were. Silent statements delivered in front of cameras, understood by millions without a single word being spoken. And that's a level of communication most people can't achieve even with a microphone and a prepared script. Which is why these dresses continue to fascinate, because they suggest a kind of control over narrative that feels both powerful and elusive. And as this understanding deepens, it starts to influence not just how Diana is remembered, but how fashion itself is perceived, because her legacy quietly challenges the idea that clothing is superficial, instead presenting it as something capable of carrying meaning, intention, and even resistance. And this shift has had a lasting impact on designers, stylists, and public figures who now operate in a world where every outfit can be analyzed, interpreted, and sometimes even overanalyzed to the point where a simple choice becomes a headline. And while that might sound exhausting, it's also a testament to how much Diana changed the rules, because before her, fashion at that level was often seen as decorative, secondary, something that complemented the person rather than defined them. But after her, it became clear that clothing could shape perception just as much as words or actions, and that realization has created an entirely new kind of awareness, one where public figures are constantly navigating not just what they say or do, but what they wear and how it will be interpreted. And in a way, that's part of Diana's ongoing influence, a legacy that extends far beyond the physical dresses themselves into the very framework of modern image-making. But here's where things take another unexpected turn, because as much as these dresses are studied, displayed, and valued, there's also a growing recognition that their true significance might never be fully captured in any one place, any one collection, or any one price tag, because the meaning attached to them is too complex, too layered, too tied to individual perception. And that creates a kind of tension between the desire to preserve these objects and the understanding that what made them special in the first place can't be preserved in the same way. Because you can protect the fabric, you can control the environment, you can document the history, but you can't recreate the moment. You can't replicate the exact feeling of seeing Diana step into the public eye wearing something that instantly captured attention and shifted the narrative in ways that were both subtle and profound. And that limitation is important, because it reminds us that no matter how much value is assigned to these dresses, no matter how carefully they are maintained or how highly they are priced, they are still, in some sense, echoes of something that existed in a specific time and place. And that can never be fully recreated, only remembered. And yet, despite that, people continue to seek them out, continue to invest in them, continue to display them, almost as if there's an unspoken belief that by holding on to these objects, they can hold on to a piece of that moment, even if only symbolically. And that belief is what keeps the entire phenomenon alive. Because as long as people feel that connection, as long as they see something in these dresses that resonates with them, whether it's elegance, resilience, transformation, or simply the memory of a time when the world felt a little different, they will continue to matter. And that ongoing relevance is what separates Diana's dresses from almost every other collection of clothing in history, because most fashion is tied to a specific era, a specific trend, a specific context that eventually fades. But these dresses have managed to transcend that, to exist outside the usual life cycle of fashion, and instead become part of a larger cultural narrative that continues to evolve. And that evolution is perhaps the most fascinating aspect of all, because it means that the story isn't finished. It's still being written, still being interpreted, still being expanded by each new person who encounters these dresses and finds something meaningful in them. And that ongoing process ensures that their value, both cultural and financial, remains dynamic, constantly shifting in response to new perspectives, new contexts, and new generations who bring their own understanding to the story. And in that sense, Diana's dresses are not just relics of the past, they are active participants in the present, continuing to influence, inspire, and provoke thought in ways that few objects ever do. And perhaps that's the ultimate reason why people paid fortunes for them and continue to do so, because they're not just buying something that existed, they're buying something that continues to exist, not in the physical sense alone, but in the cultural imagination, in the collective memory, in the ongoing conversation about who Diana was, what she represented, and why, even now, so many years later, we're still drawn to the story told through something as deceptively simple as a dress. And in the end, after the auctions quiet down, after the glass displays are dimmed and the last visitor steps away, what remains is something far more powerful than any price tag ever recorded. Because when you strip away the headlines, the bidding wars, and the staggering numbers, you're left with a simple, almost unsettling realization. These dresses were never supposed to last this long in the world's imagination. They were never designed to carry this much weight. And yet, here they are, decades later, still holding attention in a way that feels almost defiant, as if they've refused to follow the natural order of things, because most objects fade into obscurity. They lose relevance. They become footnotes in history. But Diana's dresses did the opposite. They expanded. They grew. They became more significant over time. And that kind of transformation forces you to reconsider what value actually means. Because clearly it's not just about rarity or craftsmanship. It's not even about beauty. It's about something far less tangible and far more difficult to define, something closer to emotional permanence. The idea that certain moments, certain people, certain symbols embed themselves so deeply into collective memory that anything connected to them inherits that permanence. And that's exactly what happened here. These dresses became anchors for memory, physical reminders of a presence that people weren't ready to let go of. And that refusal to let go is what kept the story alive, what kept the interest growing, what kept the numbers climbing, because every time one of these dresses appears, whether in an auction, a museum, or even just a photograph, it doesn't feel like something old resurfacing. It feels like something ongoing, something that never fully ended, and that continuity is what makes the entire phenomenon so unique, because it blurs the line between past and present in a way that very few cultural artifacts ever manage to do. And this is where the final layer of the story reveals itself, because at its core, this was never just about Diana, and it was never just about fashion. It was about connection, about the human need to hold on to something that feels meaningful in a world where meaning can sometimes feel fleeting. And Diana, whether intentionally or not, became a focal point for that need, a figure through which people could project their own emotions, their own experiences, their own interpretations of grace, struggle, and transformation. And her dresses became the vessels that carried those projections, objects that allowed people to externalize something internal, to see in fabric what they felt in themselves. And that's why the value never settled into something predictable, because it was never just about the object. It was about the relationship between the object and the observer. And that relationship changes over time. It deepens, it shifts, it adapts to new contexts, which means the value is never static. It's always evolving, always being renegotiated with each new generation that encounters the story. And that ongoing evolution is what ensures that these dresses will continue to matter, not just as historical pieces, but as living symbols. And perhaps that's the most remarkable outcome of all, that something as ordinary as clothing could transcend its original purpose so completely that it becomes part of a much larger narrative about memory, identity, and the ways in which we choose to remember the people who left an impact on the world. Because in the end, that's what this has always been about. Not the dresses themselves, but what they represent, the moments they captured, the emotions they carried, the stories they continue to tell. And as long as those stories resonate, as long as people continue to see something of themselves reflected in them, the question of why people paid fortunes for these dresses will never have a simple answer. Because the answer isn't found in the fabric, it's found in the meaning we attach to it. And meaning, unlike anything else, doesn't come with a fixed price. It comes with a story, and some stories, no matter how many years pass, are simply too powerful to ever be reduced to numbers alone.